All right. Are you ready to get into some really heavy stuff? I mean, this is a big one, right? The death penalty. You've given us some pretty intense material this time.
Yeah, this is a lot.
Yeah, we're talking like stories straight from death row,
Yep.
right? We've got the families on both sides of this, and
Mm.
even people who, are tasked with actually, you know, carrying these executions out.
Yeah, it's a wide range of perspectives.
Yeah. So buckle up. I think this one's really going to stay with you for a while.
It's interesting, isn't it, how the death penalty has almost become this clinical thing.
Yeah.
We've gone from public hangings and, to this very sort of medicalized way of ending a life.
Yeah, and one of the sources that you gave me was it was an execution doctor.
Right.
And he said, and I quote, "The medicalization of execution, I think, does impact public perception. Does that make us more comfortable with capital punishment? Probably."
It's a good question.
Yeah. I mean, it really makes you think, right? Like, does changing the way we do it actually change how we feel about it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It raises the question, are we, by making it seem less brutal, are we actually obscuring the reality
Yeah.
that a life is being taken? Does it allow society to sort of distance itself
Right.
from the gravity of what's happening?
Yeah, this case, that we read about, the execution of Billy Wayne Cobble down in Texas,
Right.
really kind of, I don't know, it brings it home.
Yeah.
Because you have his son and daughter-in-law. I mean, they were just distraught.
Obviously.
But then on the other side of things, you have, the victims' families, and they were talking about, going to celebrate at a casino,
Yeah.
After the execution.
It's a stark contrast.
Yeah.
That's the thing about the death penalty.
Yeah.
It creates this illusion of closure.
Yeah.
But when you look closer, the victim's family may find, temporary relief,
Mm-hmm.
but the pain doesn't just vanish.
Right.
And for the family, the person who was executed, there's this whole other layer of trauma. No one truly wins.
Right.
It's just the damage just ripples outward.
Yeah. We also read about this wild story it's almost like straight out of a movie.
Oh, yeah.
Juan Catalan. This guy was facing execution, and he ended up being saved because he happened to be at a Curb Your Enthusiasm shoot at Dodger Stadium
Yeah.
the night of the crime. I mean, talk about a random...
I know. A random twist of fate.
Yeah, Catalan's story, I think, is fascinating because it shows just how fragile the system can be.
Right.
You have a man who's almost executed for a crime he didn't commit.
Yeah.
And he's saved by a sitcom.
Right.
Of all things. I mean, it just shows how flawed police work can be.
Yeah.
How easily things can go wrong,
Yeah.
even with these life or death consequences.
Yeah. And that really, I think, makes the role of medical professionals in all this
Right.
even more ethically complex.
Right. Because we have this execution doctor arguing that what he's doing is essentially providing end-of-life care.
Right.
Similar to what a terminally ill patient might receive. But how do you reconcile that, as a doctor? You're sworn to preserve life,
Yeah.
but then you're participating in an execution.
It's a huge ethical dilemma. And, not everyone in the medical community agrees on this.
Absolutely.
There's been a lot of pushback against physicians participating in executions.
Yeah,
Many people are arguing that it directly contradicts the Hippocratic Oath.
exactly. So you've got these doctors, wrestling with their conscience.
Ah.
You've got families shattered on both sides.
Yeah.
And then you have this guy, Jerry Gibbons. He's this former executioner from Virginia. And this guy actually carried out 62 executions before he completely had a change of heart.
Yeah, Given's story it's really powerful because he started as a staunch believer in the death penalty.
Yeah.
But after years of personally carrying out these executions, he started to question everything.
Yeah.
There was a gradual transformation, but he eventually got to this really profound realization.
Yeah.
And he said, "The only killer that I could see was myself."
Yeah.
Heavy stuff.
It really makes you think about that psychological toll
Oh, yeah.
on the people who actually have to carry these sentences out.
Right.
Even if they believe in it initially,
Right. Yeah.
To come to terms with that kind of burden and to start questioning everything you thought you knew about justice.
It's really a stark reminder that even the people who are tasked with upholding the system can be deeply affected by it.
Right.
They have to grapple with the moral weight of it.
Yeah, and Given's story also exposes this potential for human error.
Oh, yeah.
Right, because he had a direct encounter with a guy named Earl Washington Jr.,
Right.
who was an inmate on death row.
Yeah.
And Givens was actually prepping for his execution when they issued a stay.
Right.
Turns out Earl was innocent.
It's amazing.
I know. I mean, talk about, like, this case really makes you question everything, right? It wasn't just some, theoretical error.
Right.
It was a real guy.
Yeah.
Moments away from death.
Yeah.
Who could have been wrongfully executed.
And it makes you wonder, how many other Earl Washingtons are out there?
Exactly.
How can we justify a system where that kind of mistake, that grave of a mistake, is even possible?
It's scary. And on top of all of this, there's this financial burden of the death penalty.
Right.
This isn't just, a moral debate.
Yeah.
It's an economic one, too.
You're absolutely right. You've got the trials, you've got the appeals that can drag on for decades.
Yeah.
You've got the cost of housing death row inmates.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we read that just in 2020, just 5 federal executions.
Yeah.
Cost taxpayers $4.7 million.
$4.7 million for 5 executions. That's a staggering number.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
And it raises this critical question. Is this really the best use of our resources?
Yeah.
Could that money be better spent on, programs that address the root causes of crime?
Right.
Or provide support for victims' families?
Yeah, this focus on punishment.
Yeah.
I mean, it raises another question too, right? Is the death penalty even really a deterrent?
That's where the data gets really murky.
Yeah.
Studies on deterrence are pretty inconclusive.
Right.
And the research is often really politically charged.
Yeah.
But I think when you factor in, the racial and geographic disparities,
Yeah.
the argument for its effectiveness really weakens.
It's true. Like your location and your race can drastically impact whether you even face the death penalty in the first place.
Absolutely.
Which really calls into question the fairness of the whole thing.
It does.
And that actually brings us to another important point,
Yeah.
which is, victims' voices, they're not a monolith.
No, they're not.
Even within the same case, you can have completely different viewpoints on the death penalty.
The Boston Marathon bombing is a really good example of that.
Right.
You had some survivors who were adamant about seeking the death penalty for Dzhokhar Tsarnaev.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had others, like Karen Brizard,
Yeah.
who actively campaigned against it.
Yeah.
And she said something really, really interesting. She said, I don't want my decision to be based on how angry I get in those instances.
Wow.
She recognized the gravity of taking a life.
Right.
Even in response to such a horrific act.
Yeah. And then there's the story of Shannon Schieber's parents. Their daughter was murdered. And despite immense pressure to support the death penalty for her killer,
Right.
they actually chose to advocate for life in prison.
Yeah, they even went so far as to meet with the killer's mother.
Wow.
Finding this shared space of grief and pain.
Right.
It's a really powerful example of choosing compassion over vengeance.
Yeah.
Recognizing that another death wouldn't bring their daughter back.
I think they understood that, true justice isn't about perpetuating the cycle of violence.
Right.
It's about finding a path towards healing and restoration.
Their story shows us that there are alternative paths to justice.
Yeah.
Paths that, prioritize rehabilitation and acknowledge the shared humanity
Right.
of everyone involved,
Right.
even in the face of immense tragedy.
It's clear that the death penalty isn't a simple issue.
It's not.
Right. I mean, we've got ethical dilemmas for medical professionals,
Yeah.
the psychological toll
Yeah.
that it takes on everyone involved.
Yeah.
And then this very real possibility of executing innocent people.
Absolutely. And we haven't even touched on, the historical context,
Right.
the financial burden or the arguments against the death penalty based on, religious or philosophical grounds.
Right.
It's a complex web
Huh.
of all these interconnected issues.
Yeah.
And each one is worthy of a deeper exploration.
It's a lot to unpack, and
Yeah.
and it's definitely challenging our own, assumptions about justice and punishment.
That's the beauty of these deep dives.
Yeah.
They force us to confront these uncomfortable truths,
Yeah.
to wrestle with these really difficult questions,
Mhm.
and ultimately to form our own informed opinions.
Because this isn't just a theoretical debate. This is a conversation with real world consequences.
Absolutely.
Right.
And each of us has a role to play in shaping a more just and compassionate society.
So as we continue to kind of explore these sources, just keep asking yourself, where do you stand on this? You know, what does justice really mean to you?
What role do you want to play in shaping a better future?
You know, these are big questions,
Get that cold, right?
and we're going to get into them, so stick with us.
It's really striking, when you compare Juan Catalan's case where, media attention actually helped exonerate him with Billy Wayne Cobble's execution.
Yeah.
Both of them received a lot of media coverage,
Right.
but the outcomes were completely different.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It shows how media coverage can be, I don't know, it's like a double-edged sword.
It is.
Right. In Catalan's case, it helped expose the flaws in his prosecution.
Yeah.
And it ended up saving his life.
Right.
But in Cobble's case, it just seemed to amplify all the existing tensions and emotions surrounding the execution.
Exactly. We saw, all those interviews with Cobble's family, the victims' families, law enforcement.
Yeah.
It became this very public spectacle of grief, anger, everything in between.
Yeah, it makes you wonder,
Yeah.
even when an execution is carried out behind closed doors, is there still this element of, like, public performance to it?
It almost feels like it becomes this societal drama playing out on this national stage.
Right.
And it reinforces these ideas we have about justice and retribution.
And that's where I think the ethical considerations become even more, like, tangled up.
They do.
Right. Are we really comfortable as a society with this kind of, like, public emotional display?
Right.
What does that say about us? About our relationship with justice and punishment?
Yeah, these are tough questions to grapple with.
They are.
But they're essential if you're going to have, an honest conversation about capital punishment.
Yeah, and speaking of honesty, we can't ignore the elephant in the room,
right?
The issue of racial disparities in the death penalty.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
The data is very stark.
It is.
Black defendants are far more likely to be sentenced to death than white defendants.
Yeah.
Especially when the victim is white.
It's a really disturbing statistic.
It is.
And it raises these serious questions about the fairness, right?
The impartiality of the system.
Is the death penalty truly about justice?
Yeah.
Or is it, as some argue, a modern-day reflection of this long history of racial bias in our legal system?
Yeah, that's a really crucial question.
It is.
And it's one that we can't shy away from.
We can't.
We have to confront that historical context.
Right.
We have to acknowledge those systemic biases that have shaped how we view, crime and punishment.
It's so easy to get caught up in, the legal arguments, the technicalities.
Right.
But at its core, this is about human lives.
Exactly. We can't lose sight of the human stories at the heart of this issue.
Every statistic, every legal precedent represents real people whose lives have been irrevocably altered by this system.
We've read about families that are, shattered by murder.
Yeah.
We've heard the remorseful words of people who are condemned to die.
And we even, delved into the reflections of those who are tasked with carrying out these executions.
Each story offers this unique glimpse into the overwhelming weight of the death penalty.
Yeah, they underscore this really fundamental truth.
Yeah.
This isn't a simple issue with, clear-cut answers.
No.
It's not a black and white debate about right or wrong.
It's this tangled web of legal, ethical, and social complexities.
And there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. What we need is a more nuanced conversation. One that recognizes the complex nature of this issue.
Right.
And fosters empathy for everyone involved.
Yeah. We need to listen to the voices of victims and their families.
Right.
Without, presuming to know their feelings or their desires.
And we need to understand the perspective of law enforcement and legal professionals while acknowledging the very real human cost of their decision.
And we can't shy away from confronting those harsh realities of racial bias and systemic injustice that permeates our justice system.
This isn't some, intellectual exercise, some detached philosophical debate, for a classroom.
Right.
These are real people, real families, real communities wrestling with this immense loss and the pursuit of justice.
At its core, it's a reflection of who we are as a society.
It is.
What values do we prioritize? What kind of future are we trying to create?
The death penalty forces us to confront these fundamental questions.
And that's maybe its most valuable contribution to this conversation.
It compels us to think more critically, to dig deeper, and to strive for a more just and compassionate world.
It reminds us that even amidst unimaginable tragedy, there's always space for empathy,
there is
understanding,
and hope.
And that even in the darkest moments, we can choose to be better.
We can to build a future where justice isn't defined by retribution. But by healing and restoration.
Those are powerful words.
They are.
And they lead us to another really critical question.
Okay.
If not the death penalty, then what?
What are the alternatives?
What other approaches to justice might address the needs of victims?
Right.
Hold perpetrators accountable and foster some real societal healing.
Some of the sources we've looked at offer some potential solutions. Some people argue for a greater focus on restorative justice.
Right.
Which prioritizes repairing the harm that was caused by the crime. And facilitates dialogue between victims and offenders.
Others advocate for life sentences without the possibility of parole as a more humane and cost-effective alternative to capital punishment, while still ensuring, public safety.
Right.
And then there's this growing movement advocating for comprehensive criminal justice reform that tackles the root causes of crime.
Right.
Like poverty, inequality.
Lack of access to education.
Lack of access to opportunity.
These are just a few of the many possibilities that are being explored. And while there's not, a simple fix, a magical solution, the fact that we're even having these discussions is a positive step.
It suggests that we're evolving as a society, that we're starting to question these long-held assumptions about crime and punishment.
We're open to imagining a world where justice isn't about seeking revenge, but about transformation, reconciliation, and the possibility of redemption.
One of the things that really struck me in these sources is the impact on the executioners themselves. The people who actually have to carry out the sentence.
Right. It's a perspective that we don't often consider.
You're absolutely right. Their stories are really crucial, I think, to understanding the full weight of capital punishment. Remember Jerry Givens?
Yes.
He talked about this psychological burden of taking another human life, even when it's, sanctioned by the state.
Right.
He described it as this transformation, a necessary hardening of his heart to be able to do the job.
It's like they have to detach from their own humanity to carry out the sentence.
In order to function.
And even then, the burden of what they've done stays with them.
It does.
Givens said, and this is a direct quote, the death certificate reads, death by homicide. It don't make sense. I don't want to be considered as a person just committed a homicide, but that's what it reads.
Wow.
It's powerful.
It is. And it forces us to confront this question. What does it do to a person to be the instrument of death?
Right. What are the long-term consequences of these individuals?
And how do they reconcile their actions with their own sense of morality?
The execution doctor that we read about seemed to have a more detached clinical view of his role. He compared it to end-of-life care. But Givens, who was much more involved in the process, clearly struggled with the moral weight of his actions.
It raises this question. Is it even possible to compartmentalize something like that? To separate the personal from the professional when you're, literally taking a human life?
That's a tough one.
These are questions that deserve a lot more attention.
They do.
We need to understand the experiences of those who are on the front lines of capital punishment.
For sure.
Not just the legal and philosophical debates, surrounding it. Yeah, it feels like we've uncovered this like whole other layer of this death penalty debate.
We have.
The human cost on the people who actually have to carry it out.
Their stories really bring the issue to life in a way that, legal arguments or statistics just can't.
Right.
We read about that execution doctor who had this almost detached medical justification for his role.
Yeah.
But then you have someone like Jerry Givens, the former executioner, who went through this profound transformation, eventually coming to see himself as the killer in the equation.
It's like they're caught in this impossible moral bind.
They are.
They're tasked with upholding the law, carrying out a sentence. But in doing so, they're also forced to confront this weight of taking a human life.
And that confrontation can leave lasting scars.
It can.
Givens, even after all these years, still grapples with the psychological and emotional toll of his actions.
Yeah, it's a really powerful reminder.
It is.
That the impact of the death penalty extends like way beyond the courtroom.
It does.
Or the execution chamber.
It touches the lives of everyone involved.
Even the ones we don't often think about.
Right.
It's almost like we're asking these individuals to sacrifice a part of themselves in service of the state.
To suppress their own empathy.
Right.
And their humanity.
To carry out this incredibly difficult task.
Yeah. And the question is, at what cost?
Exactly.
A question that we as a society need to really grapple with.
Yeah.
If we're going to have a death penalty, we need to acknowledge and understand the burden it places on those who are actually carrying it out.
Absolutely.
Their stories need to be heard.
Yeah.
Their experiences need to be understood.
Yeah.
Because they offer a unique and often overlooked perspective on the true cost of capital punishment.
So where do we go from here? I mean, we've explored the history, the ethical dilemmas, the impact on individuals, the systemic flaws.
The voices of those who are directly impacted.
Right.
It's been a heavy journey.
It has.
But incredibly important.
Yeah, and I think the most crucial takeaway from all of this,
I agree,
is that the death penalty, it's not some, abstract concept to be debated in a vacuum.
It's a deeply human issue.
It is.
With profound and far-reaching consequences.
And it forces us to confront our values.
Our beliefs about justice, punishment.
Right.
And really the very nature of humanity.
Yeah, we've seen how the death penalty can fracture families.
Traumatize communities.
Yeah.
Leave these lasting scars on everyone it touches.
But we've also seen these glimmers of hope. Stories of forgiveness. Compassion, the search for alternative paths to justice.
And that's what we should be striving for.
Yeah.
A justice system that acknowledges the complexity of these situations.
Oh, absolutely.
A system that prioritizes healing and restoration over retribution and vengeance.
We may not have all the answers, but I think the very act of engaging in this conversation, of wrestling with these difficult questions.
It's a step in the right direction.
It is.
It's a sign that we're evolving.
Yeah.
That we're willing to challenge our assumptions and imagine a better future.
So as we conclude this deep dive, we leave you with this final thought.
Yeah.
What if, instead of focusing on ending lives, we dedicated ourselves to creating a world where those lives are valued?
Yeah.
Where they never reach the point of being disposable?
What if, instead of clinging to this flawed system, we dared to envision something better?
Yeah.
Something more humane, something that truly reflects our shared humanity?
The answers, they may not be easy to find.
They're not.
But the pursuit of them, the willingness to grapple with these complex issues.
That's what makes us human.
It does. So keep questioning.
Yeah.
Keep exploring.
Keep diving deep.
Yeah. Because ultimately, that's how we create a more just and compassionate world.
For everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
Stay curious.